The Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I inform the House that the Minister for Local Government, Territories and Roads is ill and will be absent from question time today. The Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Transport and Regional Services will answer questions on his behalf.
Questions? Are there any questions? The Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. If the Prime Minister wins the next election, will he withdraw Australian combat forces from Iraq before he retires?
The Honourable the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, the policy of the government has always been that our forces will remain in Iraq according to the rights and interests of the Iraqi people and the interests of this nation, not according to the personal interests of an individual.
The Honourable Member for Hasluck.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Prime Minister. Would the Prime Minister outline to the House how Australian families benefit from low unemployment? Is the Prime Minister aware of policies that will increase unemployment?
The Honourable the Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the member for Hasluck for his question. The member for Hasluck and his Labor opponent in the forthcoming election really present a microcosm of what the policy debate is all about. The member for Hasluck employed people when he was in business before he came into this parliament. He was an extremely successful small businessman, and he was somebody who actually worked hard to give people jobs. His Labor opponent is a former trade union official, Mr Speaker. And need I say any more? She is committed to a policy which will result in higher unemployment. My colleague from Hasluck lived a life before he came into this parliament that actually gave jobs to people and reduced unemployment. And I might remind the House that in 1996 the unemployment rate in Hasluck was 7.4%. In March of this year it had fallen to a mere 3.1%, Mr Speaker. I might also inform the House, Mr Speaker, that figures that came out today on the long-term unemployment levels in this country show that in the time that this government has been in office, the level of long-term unemployment has fallen by 66.3%, Mr Speaker. It was in excess of 330,000 in 1996. It is now a bare 66,700. But it can get lower, and we can have, in reality in this country, a full employment society. And when I talk about a full employment society, I talk about one where every person who wants a job and is able to have a job gets the job, but also a society where not only do they get the job of their choice, Mr Speaker. And we have it within our grasp if we do the right thing economically. Over the years ahead, we have it within our grasp to create a genuine full employment society in Australia. We won't create it if we wind back industrial relations reforms. We won't create it by driving up unemployment, which would be the result of Labor's policies. Those long-term unemployment lists would begin to climb again because Labor's returning of the unfair dismissal laws would result in unemployment rising once again because small business would be intimidated out of taking on the staff that they plainly have done over the last 16 months when the new industrial relations laws have been in operation. So I say in reply to the member for Hasluck, the greatest human dividend of all of good economic policy is to reduce unemployment. The greatest goal any government can have is to create a society where people have the jobs not only that they're able to do, the jobs they want, and that we have a society where every Australian who wants to work and can work is able to get a job and is able to get a job of their choice. That's the society that we want. It's a society that could never be achieved under the Australian Labor Party.
The Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question again is to the Prime Minister. I refer the Prime Minister to Labor's $450 million plan to give all Australian 4-year-olds 15 hours of preschool education a week for 40 weeks a year, delivered by a qualified teacher Will the Prime Minister detail his plan for the future of Australian 4-year-olds?
Order. I'll call the Prime Minister.
Right.
The member for Bass.
I think the first thing that I would detail, the first and most important thing that we can do for the 4-year-olds of this country is to make sure their parents have a job. Yeah, Mr. Speaker, that is the most important thing we can do. And that's the best policy that any government can offer to ensure that every child in this country grows up in a household where their parents are in work. And I'm very proud of the fact that the number of jobless households in Australia has declined markedly during the time that this government has been in office, and I am distressed at the prospect that under Labor's high unemployment policy, the number of jobless households would rise yet again, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Solomon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is addressed to our first-class Treasurer. Would the Treasurer inform the House of results of the latest assessment of the Australian economy by the International Monetary Fund? What does this report say about the government's economic and financial management?
The honourable the Treasurer.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my answer is addressed to our first-class member for Solomon. I think I can say the best member that Solomon has ever had in the history of Australia. Mr. Speaker.
Order.
I'm glad the member for Batman understood what I was saying, Mr. Speaker. He's really on top of his game today. There are some union officials that are really quick, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker,
the Treasurer has the call.
Today the International Monetary Fund released its annual assessment of the Australian economy. Mr. Speaker, the IMF does a report on every one of the members of the IMF, some 150, 160 nations around the world, on an annual basis. This is done by the independent IMF, which is Washington-based, of course, and is the premier economic institution of the world. The report, which was released in relation to Australia, notes that we are now in our 15th year of continuous economic growth, this government having presided over nearly 12 of those years. That growth is strong, around about 4%, and inflation low at around about 2.5%. And this is what the IMF said in its report today. I ask the House to listen to this quote. This is the IMF speaking. Executive directors commended the Australian authorities for their exemplary macroeconomic management, which is widely recognised as being at the forefront of international best practice. Mr. Speaker, that's not me, that's not the Prime Minister, that's not the Liberal Party, that is the IMF, which describes Australia's economic management as at the forefront of international practice. The IMF noted that we have improved our fiscal sustainability by accumulating surpluses, eliminating net debt and establishing the Future Fund to provide for future liabilities. And, Mr. Speaker, of course, if Labor had had its way, we'd never have been able to do that. Labor opposed balancing the budget. Labor opposed paying off debt. Labor opposed making sure that the Future Fund was locked up for future generations of Australians. Now, Mr. Speaker, there is only one area that the IMF raised for concern in relation to the fiscal situation in Australia. Now, bear in mind, this is not me, it's not the Australian Treasury, it's the Washington-based IMF. The IMF sounded a note of caution in this international report on Australia in relation to spending by state governments. Mr. Speaker, this is what the IMF said. A stimulus that raises concern comes from the states. The states are collectively forecasting a fiscal deficit of around 0.5% of GDP, which constitutes a reversal of the surplus position that the states have been in until 2005-06. The catch-up in infrastructure spending comes at a time when there is already strong competition for human and capital resources from the private sector. As a result, this is putting more pressure on resources and could begin to bid up prices. Now, Mr Speaker, that's what the IMF said. And the point that the IMF is making is that when you have a huge investment surge going on in this country, an investment surge that is being led by the private sector, for a level of government to come in and to run a deficit and to put pressure in relation to that capacity could have an effect on prices. I want to say, as I've said in this House before, there's nothing wrong with building infrastructure. The Australian government is engaged in the biggest infrastructure program in Australian history. But what we do, Mr Speaker, is we fund our infrastructure program and we add to savings with a surplus. What the states do is they do not fund their infrastructure program and they borrow savings, running deficits. Mr Speaker, if the Australian Labor Party really was courageous, if it really wanted to show that it understood economic policy, it would take the opportunity to condemn those Labor state governments who have moved their budgets from surpluses into deficits. If Mr Rudd, the Leader of the Opposition, wanted to show that he had the bottle to stand up to a state premier, Mr Speaker, he would come right out and he would make it entirely clear that when—
The Treasurer resume his seat. Members should be aware when the Speaker stands, there will be silence or I will deal immediately with them. The member for Lilly will remove himself under Standing Order 94A. The Treasurer.
Mr Speaker, if the Leader of the Opposition wanted to show any bottle whatsoever on economic policy, he would have the guts to stand up and to say to the state premiers of Australia that it is against Australian interests.
The Treasurer resume his seat.
The
The Treasurer resume his seat. The Honourable Manager of Opposition Business.
Mr Speaker, I ask the Treasurer to do what he's good at and withdraw and retreat. That's what you're good at. Do it again and withdraw.
The member resume his seat. The Treasurer is in order. I call the Treasurer.
Mr Speaker, because let me make it entirely clear, it is in Australia's interests that both levels of government, Mr Speaker, work together at a time like this to fund their budgets. And if this Leader of the Opposition wants to pretend he's an economic conservative, he ought to take the decision and stand up to those state premiers, make it clear, Mr Speaker, that he can take them on and stand up for Australia's interests.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question again is to the Prime Minister, and I refer to his failure to outline any plan for the future education needs of Australian preschoolers in response to the previous question. I refer now, Prime Minister, to Labor's $2 billion National Health and Hospital Reform Plan, dealing with the future challenges of the ageing population, the growing burden of chronic disease and ending the blame game between Canberra and the states. Prime Minister, apart from taking over one hospital in one seat and in one state, what is the Prime Minister's plan?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, let me deal first of all with Labor's alleged plan. At no stage has the Leader of the Opposition outlined to the Australian people what the funding arrangements might be, Mr Speaker. It remains the case that if you take over every public hospital in this country, if the Commonwealth takes over every public hospital
The member for
in this country,
Jagga.
there will need to be a massive realignment of Commonwealth state finances.
The member for Fraser.
You're looking at, what, 40%, Mr Speaker? You're looking at 40% of the money that flows from the Commonwealth to the states. And if the Leader of the Opposition is to have any credibility on this policy, he's either got to tell the states that he will take that money away from them, or he's got to tell the Australian people that in government he would unite with state Labor premiers to increase the level of the goods and services tax.
Warned.
Mr Speaker, that is the choice that the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker, has to face. He pretends that he has a policy.
The member for Swan is warned too.
It is no more than a flimsy press release. You cannot have a credible policy unless you explain to the Australian people how it will be funded, Mr Speaker. If you raise the possibility of taking over public hospitals, you have to tell the Australian people how you're going to fund that takeover. Are you going to take the money back from the states, or are you going to increase the GST? Have a choice, I would say to those who sit opposite.
Order. Prime Minister, resume his seat. The member for Fowler is warned. The honourable member for Fraser.
The point of order, Mr Speaker, is the question was designed to find out what the Prime Minister's plan
resume his
is.
seat. That is not a point of order. I call the Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition prefaced his question by reference to Labor's
The member for
policy,
Gellibrand is warned.
and I said that I would first deal with Labor's policy and then I would deal with the government's, Mr Speaker. And the question I put rhetorically to the Leader of the Opposition, if you are going to take over public hospitals, if you are going to take over 762 public hospitals, you've got to explain to the Australian public how you are going to fund that takeover. You must either take billions of dollars away from the states, and I know that you wouldn't have the guts to take a penny away from a state Labor Premier, Mr Speaker. You must either do that, or alternatively you should concede that in government you might unite with Labor Premiers to increase the level of the GST, and it's been calculated that you'd need a 4% rise in the GST to fund it, Mr Speaker. 40% rise in the GST in order to fund this takeover. So the Leader of the Opposition can't slide away from public scrutiny on this policy. It's not enough, Mr Speaker.
Order. The Prime
It's
Minister
not
resume his
enough
seat. The Prime Minister resume his seat. The member for Parramatta will remove herself under Standing Order 94A. The Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition asked me about government health policy. Let me start by invoking the words of my friend and colleague, the Minister for Health and Ageing. The Howard government is the best friend that Medicare has ever had, Mr Speaker. And under Mr Speaker, this government's changes to bulk billing arrangement, and I remember when those who sat opposite only talked about bulk billing levels. That was their constant mantra, that bulk billing has fallen under this government. The truth is, Mr Speaker, that for people over the age of 65, for children under the age of 16 and for people living in remote and regional areas of Australia, bulk billing levels are higher than they have ever been since the introduction of Medicare, Mr Speaker. I then moved from bulk billing to the Medicare safety net. The Medicare safety net is going to be abolished by the Labor Party, Mr Speaker. The Medicare safety net guarantees that for average families, after your out-of-pocket expenses go beyond $500 a year, you get 80% refund under Medicare, Mr Speaker. Now, that was a policy that we introduced. It was a policy that was voted against by the Labor Party. It's a policy that they are still pledged to repeal. So the Leader of the Opposition asked me about our policy. I'm very, very happy to go on. That is our policy. Our policy is to keep the safety net. Labor's policy is to abolish the safety net. Our policy is to drive bulk billing levels in the areas I've mentioned to record highs. Labor is now left silent on the issue of bulk billing, Mr Speaker. We have continued to maintain a world-class pharmaceutical benefit scheme. We have invested more money year after year in medical research in this country. I'm proud of the medical research credentials of this government. We put $486 million in the 2007-8 budget on top of the $905 million in the 2006-2007 budget. Mr Speaker, we provided an additional $380 million for dental services under Medicare in the last budget. We're contributing, Mr Speaker, in many areas in cooperation with the states. For example, we've established the National Call Centre Network, Mr Speaker. We've provided $94 million a year for after-hours care, supporting over 160 after-hours GP practices and substantially increased Medicare rebates for GP attendances after-hours. We've funded over 20 co-located general practice after-hours clinics, Mr Speaker, and of course, importantly—
Order. The Prime Minister resume his seat. The member for Swan has been warned. He continues to interject. He'll remove himself under Standing Order 94A. The Prime Minister.
But, Mr Speaker, perhaps as significant of any of the policies that we've introduced and that we are guaranteed to maintain is, of course, the private health insurance rebate. Now, Labor, Mr Speaker, including the Leader of the Opposition, one of the first things the Leader of the Opposition did when he entered the parliament after the 1998 election was to vote against the private health insurance rebate, Mr Speaker. The election was held in October of 1998. The introduction of the 30% rebate was part of our election policy, and it was passed through the parliament only with the help of the then Senator Brian Harradine, Mr Speaker. The Labor Party, including the newly elected member for Griffith, his first act, Mr Speaker, virtually in this parliament was to vote against tax help for private health insurance.
Order. The Prime Minister resume his seat. The honourable member for Jellybrand on point of order.
Mr Speaker, it's a question on point of order. The Prime Minister has been going for 10 minutes and hasn't told us what his hospital plan is for the future.
That is not a point of order. I remind the member for Jellybrand she already has a warning. I call the Prime Minister.
But, Mr Speaker, I just remind the House that the first significant vote in which the Leader of the Opposition participated was to vote against the introduction of the private health insurance rebate, Mr Speaker. He did it within weeks of being elected to Parliament, Mr Speaker. Of course, he was to exceed himself some months later when he voted against the tax package, and he declared that we were approaching what a day of fundamental injustice day, Mr Speaker. Can I just say to the Leader of the Opposition, if he'd like to ask me another question on health, I'd be delighted to continue outlining the government's record.
Order. 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 I inform the House that we have present in the gallery this afternoon the Honourable Chris Gallis, a former Parliamentary Secretary and member of this House. Also present we have Christian Zara, a member of this House. On behalf of the House, I extend a very warm welcome to both of them. The honourable member for Wakefield.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Transport and Regional Services. Would the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on the response to the government's plan to secure a future for regional Australia? And are there any alternative approaches to regional policy, and what is the government's response?
The Honourable the Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Wakefield for his question and recognise in his former life before becoming a member of the federal parliament as a member of Australia's Defence Forces, had the opportunity of travelling around to many regions across Australia and experiencing life outside of the capital cities, which is in stark contrast to his Labor opponent in the upcoming election, whose main claim to fame is an official from the SDA union. I don't know, you tell me. Mr Speaker, the member for Wakefield at least has real-life experiences out there in the real world that he brings into this parliament as a member representing a constituency in South Australia. Mr Speaker, I thank the member for his question, and he asks about the policies that the coalition government has put in place to help strengthen the economic and social fabric in regional Australia. And I added to those policies yesterday when I announced the $200 million Growing Regions program, which is put in place to help those growing regions across Australia deal with the demands of rapid population growth in many parts of Australia. And of course that's been significantly welcomed across regional Australia, Mr Speaker, and it goes along with a broad suite of policies that are part of our plan in strengthening regional Australia. The Treasurer earlier referred to the largest investment in land transport in Australia's history that we are currently in the middle of investing, the $38 billion investment over 10 years in road and rail infrastructure, a lot of that strengthening regional economies, our health programs which are encouraging more doctors into rural areas, almost $1 billion to improve broadband services under Australia Connected across Australia. Mr Speaker, these are things that are happening, not things that are out there in the ether being promised by the Australian Labor Party. So, Mr Speaker, regional communities recognise the need and they appreciate the response of the coalition government, particularly with this particular policy, Mr Speaker, focusing on growing regions. And it was interesting, I saw a press release, and it's not from the member for Hotham, it's from the National Sea Change Task Force, Mr Speaker, that came out yesterday, led by Councillor Joe Natoli, and he said, and I quote, "It is clear the Deputy Prime Minister, who represents a coastal electorate, understands the sort of pressure this growth has on coastal communities, and we are delighted with the initiative he has announced today." So regional communities do appreciate what we're doing. They do appreciate it is targeted help. They also know, Mr Speaker, that all the Labor Party can do is criticise these programs. All they can do is criticise these programs, Mr Speaker, and if you only got to have a look at, if you want to know what Labor in government federally would do, you only have to look at what they do in government at a state level. Now, if you look at state Labor governments, Mr Speaker, state Labor governments, what they do to regional Australia. In New South Wales, Labor has closed nearly half of all country maternity units. In Victoria, they're draining much-needed water out of the Goulburn Valley to get it down into Melbourne because they haven't planned and invested in infrastructure in Melbourne. In Queensland, the federal government has had to step in and protect the democratic rights of local authorities in Queensland, where the Queensland government wants to wipe out local government with objective tactics that former Premier Beattie introduced. And there's a challenge to new Premier Anna Bligh in Queensland. Reverse this decision and let the people of Queensland have a say. But we go back a bit beyond that to the Goss Rudd team in the last Labor government in Queensland. And what did the Goss Rudd team do in Queensland? They cut 600 jobs at the Department of Primary Industries and shut down 4 regional DPI offices. They closed 13 regional railway lines, 3 rail workshops. 457 jobs were lost in that one move. They shut down small country schools and cut 403 teaching positions. Mr Speaker, if the people of Australia want to know what a Rudd-led Labor government will do in power in Canberra, they've only got to have a look at what state Labor does and what state Labor did when he was in charge of the reins in Queensland.
The Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question again is to the Prime Minister. I refer to my 3 previous questions to the Prime Minister, asking him to outline his future plans on Iraq, on preschools and on hospitals. I refer specifically to my previous question, which asked the PM that apart from taking over one hospital in one seat in one state, what was his plan for the future of all the nation's hospitals? Given that the Prime Minister's previous and very long answer did not mention his future plans on hospitals once, would he do so now?
The Honourable the Prime Minister.
I feel duly rebuked, Mr Speaker. I feel duly rebuked, Mr Speaker. But Mr Speaker, the difference between the Leader of the Opposition and the policy he enunciates in relation to hospitals, Mr Speaker, is to be found not only in relation to the things that I've mentioned, Mr Speaker, but also in relation to the determination of this government through the measures that it's already introduced and will continue into the future, measures that are designed to deal with some of the issues of bed blocking, issues that are designed, Mr Speaker, measures rather, that are designed to take the load off the emergency departments by introducing more after-hours services, measures which are designed to provide the co-location of GP clinics with public hospitals, measures, Mr Speaker, which are designed to ensure that by having a strong private hospital system, you take the load off the public hospital system. The great problem, and the great problem the Leader of the Opposition has, is the inherent contradiction with having opposed the development of a strong private hospital system. He in effect has placed much greater pressure on the public hospital systems of this country, Mr Speaker. Our view is that to promise the Australian people that you will take over public hospitals, you have an obligation to explain how you're going to fund that takeover. And the Leader of the Opposition so far has failed to tell the Australian people that if he does take over public hospitals, how will he fund that takeover? Will he take money from the states? Will he stand up to the state Labor premiers? Or will he, as we believe in government, join with state Labor premiers to increase the GST?
Order. The Prime Minister resume his seat. The honourable member for Gellibrand on a point of order.
It's a point of order on relevance. We still don't know what his plan is.
The member will resume his seat. I've been listening carefully to the Prime Minister. He was asked a question about hospitals. Is entirely in order. And if the member continues to take frivolous points of order, I'll deal with it. The Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, let me say very directly to the member for Gellibrand, our plan is to keep the GST at 10%. That's our plan, Mr Speaker. We don't intend to increase the GST by 40% to fund the takeover of public hospitals.
The honourable member for Cowper.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to Australia's greatest treasurer. Would the Treasurer inform the House about practical steps the government is taking to address the issue of climate change while keeping our economy strong?
The honourable Treasurer.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for Cowper, Australia's greatest member for Cowper, Mr Speaker. And can I say I understand under attack from another trade union official at the next election?
Order. The level of interjections is far too high.
Mr Speaker, it's a fair bet if you're asked who your local Labor candidate is, it's a union official. I think it's about a 70% chance that it's a union official, and I'll chance my arm here and say there's a union official running for Labor in Cowper. Is that right? Yeah, surprise, surprise. Now, Mr Speaker, one of the measures which the government has just introduced to this parliament is a very practical measure to respond to the challenge of climate change and to ensure that we have appropriate incentives, particularly through our tax system, to respond to those issues which will reduce carbon emissions and also contribute to the greening of our country and improve our environment. Australia has a wonderful but a fragile environment. We are one of the hottest and driest continents on earth. And, Mr Speaker, as a result of that, we all have an interest in forestation. We all have an interest, Mr Speaker, in encouraging the plantation industry in a way which will deal with those issues and deal with carbon emissions. This morning, the government introduced legislation into parliament which will allow a full tax deduction to carbon sink forest operators for the cost of establishing trees in a qualifying carbon sink forest. This is full deductibility. Mr Speaker, those people who are planting in a recognised qualifying carbon sink forest will be able to deduct the full cost of that and expense it in full. As a consequence of that, we believe that there will be many operators who will take the opportunity to plant trees, including planting trees in agricultural areas, where farmers will be able to make land available, maybe even in between crops, and will get a payment for their land which will be matched by the tax deduction of those that are planting the qualifying trees. Mr Speaker, this is a kick-start for carbon sink forests, and it is intended by the government that this will apply until 2012-13, when the immediate deduction will be replaced with a write-off under the general horticultural plant provisions. Mr Speaker, to qualify for this tax deductibility, operators will have to comply with environmental and natural resource management guidelines. Mr Speaker, this is a practical response to the issue of climate change. This is an important measure which will be consistent with a growing economy. This will put in place an opportunity for investors to do their bit. These are the kind of initiatives which are important to front up to the future challenges of climate change and the environment, and this is the government that is putting them into place.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. My question is again to the Prime Minister. I refer to Labor's comprehensive plan to tackle climate change, which includes ratifying the Kyoto Protocol, cutting Australian greenhouse gas emissions by 60% by 2050, and substantially increasing—
Leader of the Opposition will start his question again.
Thanks, Mr Speaker.
The members on my right— The Leader of the Opposition has the call, and he'll begin his question again.
I refer to my questions to the PM. I refer to Labor's comprehensive plan to tackle climate change, which includes ratifying the Kyoto Protocol.
The member for Flinders is warned.
Ratifying the Kyoto Protocol, cutting Australia's greenhouse gas emissions by 60% by 2050, and substantially increasing the mandatory renewable energy target. Prime Minister, after 11 long years, is this $23 million taxpayer-funded picture book, which is about to be sent out to the electors of this country, equal the totality of the Prime Minister's plan to tackle climate change?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition has asked me a question about a policy that he says is the great moral challenge of the age, but he almost forgot to mention when he saw the most powerful man in the world in Sydney last week. Totally forgot to mention, Mr Speaker, I mean it is a measure of the Leader's moral fervour on these matters that it's not on the agenda for such an important meeting. I'd say in reply to the Leader of the Opposition, we're very proud of the balanced approach we have to climate change, Mr Speaker. We actually believe in tackling climate change without undermining the strength of the Australian economy. And the Sydney Declaration, Mr Speaker, and I know the Leader of the Opposition was rather disappointed that it was achieved last week for the first time, Mr Speaker. The United States, China and Russia, the three greatest emitters in the world, united then in a commitment to an aspirational target, Mr Speaker, an aspirational target for the in reduction in greenhouse gases, Mr Speaker. It does represent a new international consensus on climate change, Mr Speaker, and if the world can agree on a common emissions goal, Mr Speaker, with all countries contributing, reflecting their own capacities, Mr Speaker, then indeed there is some hope for a balanced approach, Mr Speaker. But I'd remind the Leader of the Opposition, with his references to 11.5 years, I'd remind him of the $2 to $3 billion that the government has committed to various measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I'd remind him that the emissions trading system to which the government is committed is a world's best in terms of emissions trading system. It has more comprehensive coverage. It covers some 70%, Mr Speaker, of greenhouse gas emissions, vastly higher than the European and other models long championed by the Leader of the Opposition and the member for Kingsford Smith. So I would say, in reply to the Leader of the Opposition, I don't regard his plan as comprehensive. He's so ashamed of it, or lacks fervour and commitment to it, that he doesn't mention it when he meets the President of the United States. it's such a moral crusade for the Leader of the Opposition that he doesn't mention it in the most important meeting he had last week. It's a measure of the way in which the performance of the Leader of the Opposition in these matters falls a long way short of his rhetoric. I think the government's approach to climate change, which balances the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions with the overwhelming need to preserve the strength of the Australian economy, is the approach that is right for Australia's future and an approach that the great majority of Australians will support.
The honourable member for Fadden.
Mr Speaker, my question is directed to the Foreign Minister. What is the government's present approach to the political situation in Iraq, and what alternative approaches are being promoted?
The Honourable Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Well, Mr Speaker, first can I thank the honourable member for Fadden for his question. This would be for certain one of the last questions, if not the last question he asks in the House of Representatives. And I know we on this side of the House, and no doubt many on the other side, believe he's been a great Member of Parliament. Be very much missed, and I know in the electorate of Fadden, the Labor Party's put up a candidate who is an official for the Liquor, Hospitality and Miscellaneous Union. I mean, imagine asking the people of Fadden to put in a union hack in place of a great man like Jolly. Mr Speaker, I thank him for his question, and let me make this pretty clear. The government of Australia supports a democratic Iraq, an Iraq free from dictatorship, and we support an Iraq free from terrorists, but this requires hard work. And as the US Ambassador in Iraq, Ambassador Crocker, said, the process will not be quick. It requires security. General Petraeus has said political progress will take place only if security exists, which of course is the whole point of the surge. Mr Speaker, I would say that it's encouraging that the surge has been working, and that some of the political signs, albeit rather early signs, are more positive than has been the case for a long time. Mr Speaker, the honourable member asked if there are any alternative views. Now, it's well known that the opposition policy is to abandon Iraq. I noticed, going through the records, that the Leader of the Opposition said on the Sunday program on the 18th of August, Labor has argued consistently against the surge, and the member for Barton, who's the Shadow Minister, has often said that the surge was a mistake and been opposed to the surge. Now, just let me make it clear about the surge. Since December 2006, there has been a 45% decline in civilian deaths, and there has been a 55% decline in sectarian deaths, and Al-Anbar province has been cleared of al-Qaeda, which was a hotbed of al-Qaeda. Now, Mr Speaker, those things have been achieved because of the surge, a surge which was completely opposed by the Leader of the Opposition, which, if I may say so, Mr Speaker, says something about his judgment. Mr Speaker, the Labor Party also argues that troops should be withdrawn from Iraq, and if foreign troops were withdrawn from Iraq, there would be political progress. Somehow this is the way to achieve some kind of political reconciliation in Iraq, to rip out from underneath the people of Iraq their security. Mr Speaker, very few people who know anything about the issues think that makes even the slightest sense. That is simply a policy built on the back of some opinion polling which has been worked by Hawker Britain. It is nothing else. Now, let me tell you what Ambassador Crocker, who I suspect knows more about this issue than the Leader of the Opposition or the member for Barton. Mr Speaker, Ambassador Crocker said to the US Congress on the 11th of September, I think, in response to a question which happened to be about Labor's policy, that is, would withdrawing the troops increase political pressure for reconciliation? And Ambassador Crocker said, I think we have to be very careful with that, frankly, and I'd be concerned that an approach that says we're going to start pulling out troops, regardless of the objective conditions on the ground and what might happen in consequence of that, could actually push the Iraqis in the wrong direction, to make them less likely to compromise rather than more likely. The fact is, Mr Speaker, that the Labor Party has never shared the government's position, and our position is that we support democracy in Iraq. Labor was happy to allow Iraq to remain a dictatorship. After all, they tried to raise $500,000 for their 1975 election campaign from that dictatorship. And don't let anybody forget the Blues Point Towers meeting between Gough Whitlam, a great Labor hero, and Bath Socialist Party officials from Iraq. I mean, Mr. Speaker, great affiliation under the flag of the Socialist International, no doubt.
The member for Melbourne is warned.
The Labor Party seems to think that the terrorists can just hack it out in Iraq and establish a base in Iraq, and that doesn't matter. At the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, that matters to our national security. For terrorists to succeed in Iraq is for terrorism to win internationally, and that in turn undermines our own national security. Mr. Speaker, this government is not about populism, it's about standing up for our national security. It's about standing up for our national security. Mr. Speaker, the trade union officials on the front bench there laugh when they know they have a leader who is totally driven by opinion polls. Probably, Mr. Speaker, intellectually there would be few people on the Labor side who think we are wrong, but all of them have decided to adopt a narrow populist approach which will reduce our national security and not enhance it.
The Honourable the Manager of Opposition Business.
Mr. Speaker, my question is addressed to the Prime Minister, and I ask, will the Prime Minister confirm that part of the Liberal Party's current political fix was an agreement that he make a public statement saying that if he wins the next election, he will retire during the next term?
Order. The member for McKellar. The Prime Minister
wants to this question, and listening to the last answer given by the Foreign Minister, I thought to myself, what is it about the member for North Sydney's electorate? You have Blues Point Tower in Maman's Point, which was the location of the infamous deal that was meant to raise $500,000 for Gough Whitlam's campaign from the Bath Socialist Party. And then, of course, you have another residence that people are very familiar with, namely Kirribilli House, Mr. Speaker, where in Mr. Speaker, be it remembered that in 1989 a secret deal was made.
The Prime Minister resumes. The member for Grainlaw on a point of order.
This is about this century.
The member for Grainlaw resume his seat. The Prime Minister has barely begun to answer his question. He is entirely in order, and if there are frivolous points of order, I'll take action. They call the Prime Minister.
Speaker, I'm very happy to remind those who sit opposite, given the question that has been asked of me with its implications, that in 1989 a secret deal was made by my two immediate predecessors in this great office, and as a result of that deal, those two men lived a lie through the whole of the 1990 election campaign, Mr. Speaker. And it ill-behoves anybody in the Australian Labor Party, Labor Party to start lecturing me or the Treasurer and Deputy Leader of the Liberal Party. Let me make it clear, there are no secret deals, Mr. Speaker. We will not be living any lies like Bob Hawke and Paul Keating, Mr. Speaker. We will level with the Australian people, as I did last night, and I made it very plain in the remarks I made last night, that if the people of Australia are kind enough to return me and my government at the next
Prime Minister resume his seat. The member for Lyons has been warned. He continues to interject. He will remove himself under Standing Order 94A. The Prime Minister. The Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I made my position very clear last night. There are no secret deals. Unlike Bob Hawke and Paul Keating, John Howard and Peter Costello will not be living any lies through the next election campaign.
The honourable member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health and Ageing. Would the Minister advise the House how the Howard government is helping families access after-hours GP services? And is the Minister aware of any alternative policies for GPs, and what is the government's response?
The honourable Minister for Health and Ageing.
Mr Speaker, I do thank the member for Lindsay for a question. And Mr Speaker, as every parent in this House knows, if your child is sick in the middle of the night, you want help here and now. You don't want to have to wait until the doctor's surgery opens at 8 o'clock the following morning. And Mr Speaker, I can inform the House that thanks to the indefatigable work of 3 great local MPs, the member for Lindsay, the member for Macquarie, the member for Greenway, 450,000 people in Western Sydney will soon have access to after-hours house calls from a GP, Mr Speaker. That's what they'll have. It's more evidence that the Howard government solves problems. It doesn't talk about these issues, it actually solves them. And it's further proof, Mr Speaker, that the Howard government is truly the best friend that Medicare has ever had. Now, Mr Speaker, I've been asked about alternative policies. Well, Mr Speaker, Labor has just committed $220 million from its $2 billion public hospital power grab towards a series of what it calls GP super clinics. Well, Mr Speaker, this $2 billion that they're always referring to, it's actually just $500 million a year. That's less than 2% of the cost of running public hospitals, which is about the same as the efficiency dividend that some state governments rip out of the public hospitals. And, Mr Speaker, they are already raiding their own piggy bank, Mr Speaker. Not only there's this $220 million for GP clinics, but just the other day they raided it for PET scanning in Newcastle, and pretty soon, Mr Speaker, there'll be absolutely none of it left. But, Mr Speaker, the point about their latest policy on GPs, it's a lot of words, but there is no real detail on precisely what extra services are going to be delivered. Now, Mr Speaker, here are some perfectly reasonable questions for the Leader of the Opposition and his health spokesman. Who will own and run these new GP clinics? How will these new GP clinics treat chronic disease differently? Will they be able to charge a fee for service in a way which is central to the operation of Medicare? And most importantly, will these clinics further strip medical services from small, rural, regional and remote communities? Now, Mr Speaker, unless Labor can spell out the details of this so-called policy, it's not a policy, it's just a PR stunt. And, Mr Speaker, there is a strong suspicion in this so-called policy that what is really happening here is that Labor is setting up government-funded salaried doctors to compete with the private profession. But, Mr Speaker, what becomes more and more obvious every time they put out these shallow press releases is that the Labor Party does not know what it's talking about on health. And the Leader of the Opposition knows that his shadow does not know what she is talking about. I'm quoting now from an article by Gerard McManus in the Herald Sun earlier this month. Mr Rudd is a hard taskmaster and is known to be unhappy with the performance of some front benchers. The body language at the recent launch of Labor's health policy said a great deal when Mr Rudd explained everything and took every follow-up question, and has given some inside Labor to question whether Nicola Roxon will have the same role after the election. One Labor MP suggested that the
Minister
launch
resume
was
his
a
seat.
setback.
The Minister will resume his seat. I have warned the member for Gellibrand. She continues to interject, even when I ask the Minister to resume his seat. She's guessed right. She will leave under Standing Order 94A. The Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I'm disappointed that the member for Gellibrand is leaving, because I was about to tell her what her colleagues really think of her. I'm quoting from Gerard McManus, who said one Labor MP suggested that the launch was a setback for Miss Roxon, who was made to look like a barrel girl standing beside game show host Rudd. Well, Mr Speaker, that's what Labor MPs think of the Shadow Minister and their leader. Well, Mr Speaker,
the member for Cunningham is warned.
Not a political game. It's about real patients who deserve real service.
The Minister resume his seat. The member for Cunningham was warned. She continued to interject. She has left under Standing Order 94A. The member for Cornwall has also been warned, so she can remove herself under Standing Order 94A too. The Minister.
Mr Speaker, I'm just quoting a very respected journalist, Gerard McManus, who said one Labor MP suggested that the whole launch had made Miss Roxon look like a barrel girl standing beside game show host Rudd. Now, Mr Speaker, if this is disgraceful, as members opposite are now suggesting, they should have a leak inquiry. They should find out which of their number said this to Gerard McManus. And let me repeat, Mr Speaker, health is too important to be treated like a game, a political game, by members opposite. Health is about real patients who need real services. Until Labor can come up with the real details of their policy, it's clear they just can't be trusted with the health care of the Australian people.
The Honourable Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is again to the Prime Minister, and I again ask the question that he refused to answer previously. Will the Prime Minister confirm that part of the Liberal Party's current political fix was an agreement that he make a public statement saying that if he wins the next election, he will retire during the next term?
The Prime Minister.
I would have thought the answer I gave was clear, but let me, for the benefit of the member for Sydney, the answer is no, Mr Speaker, and I was contrasting our candour with the deceit and lies of my two predecessors.
The Honourable Member for Corangamite.
Mr Speaker, my question is addressed to the Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations. Would the Minister inform the House how the government's employment and workplace policies are helping the long-term unemployed find work? Is the Minister aware of any threats to this contribution?
The Honourable Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations.
He averaged 72 in his last Test series, Darryl, better than anyone else. Mr Speaker, I thank the member for Corangamite for the question and note that he was a farmer before coming into this place, and I bet he has a union official running against him on behalf of the Labor Party. Is that right? And I bet that union official doesn't even live in his seat. Is that right? Is that right? That's just like North Sydney, where the Labor candidate doesn't live in the seat. And Mr Speaker, it is true that the government remains absolutely committed to putting in place policies that help to deliver higher real wages, more jobs and fewer strikes. And the government is committed to the goal that every Australian who wants to get a job can get a job, because that's what full employment is. It's amazing, Mr Speaker, we're the only government, certainly in the last 33 years, perhaps even since that Blues Point Tower deal, that could ever talk about full employment. And policies such as workplace relations reform and welfare to work have helped to deliver the infrastructure that has allowed business to employ more people and head towards full employment. The fact of the matter is, Mr Speaker, that Australia is running out of workers. We're not replacing ourselves as a nation. Our birth rate is not high enough to replace ourselves, So we need to have policies that are innovative, even some would say courageous, that actually encourage people to go into work, to get off welfare. I mean, there's only 3 places you can get the workers of tomorrow. Firstly, you can have more children. And the Treasurer, one for mum, one for dad and one for Australia, and the $5,000 baby bonus is a great incentive to do that. That's right, I've got one more to do. Mr Speaker, and I don't have much to say to it, unfortunately. Secondly, we can massively increase immigration, and we don't agree with that. We actually think we've got the immigration levels about right. And the third factor is, the third area where we can get the workers is to get some of those 2 million Australians who are on welfare but are not working into work. They are of working age, Mr Speaker, and we've got to try and access that pool. This government had the courage to introduce welfare-to-work initiatives that move people from welfare into work. Of course, the Labor Party opposed it all the way and said that we were heartless. But the bottom line is, having a 4.3% unemployment rate, having higher real wages, is not heartless. It's actually the greatest form of welfare you can possibly deliver. And today I'm releasing a report, Mr Speaker, Building Stronger Families, the benefits of moving from welfare to work, and that gives a snapshot of the success of the initiative. Mr Speaker, why do we undertake these policies? Because we are about the future welfare of the Australian people. We're about helping Australians to have more jobs and higher real wages. Of course, when the Labor Party released its workplace relations policy, it didn't say anything about jobs. It didn't say anything about higher real wages. It didn't say anything about economic prosperity. It was just a deal between the union bosses that make up 70% of the Labor front bench and others who are coming in like Combay and Shorten and Dougie Cameron. It was a deal between them and the Labor Party, Mr Speaker. And that sort of deal is bad for Australian workers, and it's bad for Australian families, Mr Speaker. And if you ever want to think carefully about what the implications are of electing a Rudd Labor government, look no further than the fact that 70% of his front bench are former union officials. 70% of his front bench. Does anyone really believe for a second that in government he would have the courage to stand up to his entire front bench and a union movement that is spending millions of dollars to get him elected? Does anyone believe that for a second? No. And the reason why, Mr Speaker, is because the Labor Party will always put the jobs of the union bosses ahead of the jobs of Australian working families.
The Honourable the Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Minister for the Environment and Water Resources.
Order. The member for Grayndler has the floor.
Yes, Mr Speaker. I refer to the Minister's answers to my question in the House yesterday regarding the Liberal Party leadership. If and when the Prime Minister retires, will the Minister be a candidate for the leadership of the Liberal Party?
Order. The member for McKellar.
Standing Order 98C says it is not associated with this business and is out of order.
The member for McKellar raises a valid point of order. The question is out of order. The member for Grayndler, does the member for Grayndler wish to rephrase that question?
Yes, Mr Speaker. I wish to refer to standing orders which refer to—
The member for Grayndler will resume his seat. The member for Grayndler is aware that I have ruled that question out of order.
Does the Minister want to answer?
The question is out of order.
What can be more within the Minister's—
The member will resume his seat. The member will resume his seat. That's as he's well aware, that's a party matter question. The Honourable the Chief Government Whip.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
The member for Fraser on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, can I ask you to reflect on that ruling? You've now created the situation— with respect, Mr Speaker, I am entitled to make my point.
The member for Fraser would be well aware if he wishes to raise questions with the Speaker,
he
will do so at the appropriate point.
I'm raising a point of order, Mr Speaker.
The member for Fraser, I'm listening carefully.
The implication of your ruling is this is the only place in Australia where that question can't be asked. How can that be what the standard—
The member for Fraser will resume his seat. The member for Fraser will resume his seat. The Honourable Chief Government Whip.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Minister for Education, Science and Training. Would the Minister update the House how the Australian Government is supporting teachers in our schools? Are there any alternative approaches, and what is the Government's response?
The Honourable Minister for Education, Science and Training.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Macquarie for his question and acknowledge his deep interest and commitment to education in his electorate. Mr Speaker, this government believes that quality education is directly linked to quality teaching. That's why we have invested over $100 million to establish Australian government summer schools for teachers. Over the next 4 years, 4,000 teachers will have the opportunity to undertake a high-quality professional learning experience in 5 summer schools that will be established across Australia. They will be in maths and science, English, literacy and numeracy and Australian history. And today I announced the successful university consortia that will hold these summer schools, the first beginning in January of next year. Now, what is the Labor Party's response to this initiative that is so welcomed by the education sector, by the individual teachers? Well, the Labor Party will close down these summer schools. They will close these summer schools. They will deny 4,000 teachers the opportunity to be leaders for greater educational standards in their schools. Now, you have to ask yourself, why would the Labor Party do that? Because the Australian Education Union told them to. The Labor Party is in lockstep with the unions, and these unions are out of control. The Australian Education Union and the New South Wales Teachers Federation have been running a dishonest and misleading campaign against this government. Now, there's nothing new in that. That's their stock in trade. But the unions are now using children as young as 6 years old to carry their propaganda. Over the last 2 days, unions in New South Wales have been forcing young children to carry home this pamphlet which contains lies to their parents. And parents are outraged. And what was the response of the Labor government in New South Wales? Well, the Education Minister, the Labor Education Minister, former union official, didn't have the courage to stand up for the parents against the union, so he sent his Director-General of Education out to tell them to stop. The unions defied the instruction, they ignored him, and they continued their tactics. And Talkback Radio and members of parliament have been swamped with calls from outraged parents complaining about their children being exploited by union members. One parent complained that a 6-year-old girl in Year 1 at Cherrybrook Public School was given a leaflet by the acting deputy principal and told she had to take it home to give to her parents. Children in a class at Normanhurst Public School were instructed to boo at any mention of John Howard, our Prime Minister, or the coalition government. These sort of tactics are taking place at Oak Hill Primary School. These similar tactics are taking place across New South Wales. Oak Hill Drive Primary School, Cobbitty Primary School, Maxville Primary School, Braddock Primary School, primary schools across New South Wales, and parents are outraged. And what has been the response of federal Labor? What has been the response of the ex-union officials sitting on the front bench? The deafening silence that we have come to expect from people who owe their very existence in this place to the patronage of the unions. The Labor Party doesn't have the courage to stand up for parents. The Labor Party doesn't have the courage to stand up against the unions. The unions own every single one of them, lock, stock and barrel.
The Honourable Member for Fraser.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, isn't it the case that a majority of your cabinet ministers including the Treasurer, the Foreign Minister, the Defence Minister, the Environment Minister, the Education Minister, the Workplace Relations Minister and the Family and the Family and Community Services Minister, believe it is not in the Liberal Party's interests that the Prime Minister stay in his position?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
No.
The Honourable Member for Kingston.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Minister for Vocational and Further Education. Would the Minister outline to the House the progress of the government's Australian technical colleges? Are there any alternative plans, and what is the government's response?
The Honourable Minister for Vocational and Further Education.
Mr Speaker, I'd like to thank the member for Kingston for his question. He's been a powerhouse in making the technical college in his area a great success. Mr Speaker, in terms of raising the status of the trades and technical training, the Australian technical colleges are already an unqualified success. When you go and meet the young people at these colleges, time and again they tell you that for the first time in their lives they feel motivated, they feel understood, they feel valued. We are restoring with these Australian technical colleges a great sense of pride and confidence in these young people. And it is resonating in local communities. Over the last few weeks, we've had hundreds of parents and prospective students attending information nights at individual colleges around the country. We've even got parents of primary-age students approaching colleges around the country seeking to book their kids into Year 11 and 12 at technical colleges for some 6 or 8 years hence. Yet, Mr Speaker, the members opposite continue to denigrate these colleges for their own selfish political purposes. And to make matters worse, the opposition is promoting a totally inadequate alternative. Labor promised between 500,000 and 1.5 million to all of the 2,650 academic secondary schools around Australia to set up so-called trade centres in all of these Australian secondary colleges. Mr Speaker, this is a policy that is being ridiculed in education circles, and for good reasons. Mr Speaker, about 4 weeks ago I reopened a renovated toilet block in a local primary school in my electorate. It's a small primary school, and the renovation of this small primary school technical block, you might laugh, they're worried about the health of their kids. This was not funded by the Labor Party, this was funded by the Australian government and the parents, because the Labor government did not do anything about the health of these young kids. But my point, Mr Speaker, is this renovation for a very small primary school cost $200,000. $200,000. My point is that it highlights the total inadequacy of $500,000, or for that matter $1.5 million, to create a trade centre in every secondary school in the country. Mr Speaker, that sort of money will not touch the sides. It is a con. It's a total con. It will see no more than an oven or a lathe in a classroom down the back end of every secondary school. And what you'll see more disturbingly is that it will only serve to further perpetuate the second-class view of a trade career in every secondary college. Can't you see it now? Every Wednesday afternoon, the kids who aren't up with it academically, they'll go down the back and do some cooking. That's all you'll achieve with this. You will perpetuate what you've been doing for 20 years, talking down the trades. It will do nothing to raise the status of the trades. Now, Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition, interestingly, listen to this, your Leader, he knows this, and he's becoming increasingly embarrassed by it. So much so that he's starting to fudge this policy. He's starting to fudge it. Just last week, the Leader of the Opposition said to a gathering at Geelong, and I quote, "Here in Corangamite," an electorate very well served by the local member, I might add, "Here in Corangamite there are some 13 secondary schools. That means 13 times $1.5 million to come to this community to make sure that we've got these trade training centres." Is that true? He went on, Corio next door, some 20 secondary schools. 20 secondary schools. That, he said, is 20 times 1.5 million. What he's saying is, what the Leader of the Opposition is now saying, that every school across the country will get 1.5 million. But that's not Labor's policy. Under Labor's policy, only 1/3 of all the schools get 1.5 million, 1/3 get $1 million, and 1/3 get $500,000. So we saw last week emerge just a little matter of a $1.5 billion gap in Labor's costings. Now, Mr. Speaker, I know that maths aren't Labor's strong point. I know that, but this wasn't a simple mathematical oversight, Mr. Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition has been selling this policy all over the country since the budget. In fact, apart from IR, which has been an absolute debacle for them, this has been the only policy where they've released any detail. And he's been selling it for months. If he doesn't know the details, I'll go he. He knew what he was doing. He knew what he was doing when he misrepresented his own embarrassing policy. He did not want to be ridiculed, so he told his audience what he thought they would prefer to hear. This was deception, plain and simple. And mark my words, Mr. Speaker, under pressure, this Leader of the Opposition reverts to type.
The honourable member for Lilly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that he has endorsed, without qualification, the Treasurer to replace him as Leader of the Liberal Party if and when he retires after the next election?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what I've said is that when I do well into the next term, if we are re-elected, and can I just make the observation that we have had 5 questions about one job, not 5 questions about millions of jobs, Mr. Speaker. And quite honestly, I think the Australian people are more interested in jobs for their children than they are whether Kevin Rudd or John Howard occupies the Prime Ministership. And it behoves everybody in this parliament to understand that we're here to serve the Australian people, not to serve our own personal egos.
The member for Brisbane.
And there's a complete obsession. Here's the humble member for Lilly.
Order. The Prime Minister resume his seat. The member for Lilly on the point of order.
Relevance.
The member for Lilly resume his seat. The member for Lilly resume his seat. The answer is entirely in order. I call the Prime Minister.
Very clear that when I cease to be the Leader of the Liberal Party, that it would be my expectation and my belief that I should be succeeded by the Deputy Leader and Treasurer, Peter Costello. But I've also acknowledged that that is not my gift. It is the gift of the Federal Parliamentary Liberal Party, as indeed the position I hold was not the gift of my predecessor, it was the gift of the Federal Parliamentary Liberal Party. But I can just add one thing, Mr. Speaker, and I remind those who sit opposite, we will not live the lie of 1990. Let it always be remembered that my 2 predecessors entered into a secret conclave and they lived a lie to the Australian people through the entirety of the 1990 election campaign, and it will ever be to the shame of the Australian Labor Party that they were part of that miserable deception and that miserable conspiracy. And I ask that further questions be placed on the notice.
I thank the Prime Minister.